Hi, fifth graders. Miss Batavia here with our Meet the Artist lesson from the Meet the Masters curriculum. Today we're going to be talking about Frederic Remington, who was an artist born in 1861 and who lived until 1909. So right at the end of the 19th century. All right, here's a picture of Frederic Remington in his adult years with the backdrop of a desert scene you can see there. He had a huge interest in what we call the Wild West or westward expansion, which we all know a lot about from learning that last year and a little bit more this year. He actually grew up in New York. So his interest came from hearing stories and things like that. And then later on, he ended up traveling out west to see it with his own eyes. Here's one of his pieces of work. What do we think these men are doing in this picture? If you said cooking, you're absolutely correct. They're actually making breakfast in this picture. A common breakfast. They needed to get a lot of protein because they were really busy through the day. They ate bacon, a lot of bacon. Who loves bacon? I love bacon. If they were lucky, they got a biscuit or two, cooked very differently than our biscuits, made from scratch out there over a campfire or a fire stove, so not baked in the oven like ours. And then they had coffee. We're told that they drank some really thick, dark coffee. We usually get hungry a couple hours later after breakfast. They did not eat lunch. This meal was to get them through the whole day, and they lived a really active lifestyle. So it's hard to imagine eating just that one meal and then being active all day. One thing that Frederic Remington was known for in his art was all of the realistic detail. When we say realistic, we mean we want to see things that look like more like a photograph than a painting. So he used the detail to create those realistic features. So expressions and trying to show action, trying to create a mood of what was going on there, maybe even detail to show us what the temperature felt like. This one is called his first lesson. Who do we think's getting the lesson in this painting? It's the horse. So this was the first time the horse was being saddled. Take a look closely at this painting. What do we see that makes us get a feel for what that horse was feeling and kind of the feel of those men that are saddling him and trying to teach him how to get used to having a rider? I noticed in the horse's face, I see emotion in the horse's face. He looks kind of startled. What's going on here? This feels new. I noticed the way, the positioning of the men, the way they're standing, that they're being really cautious. All right, so when Remington started traveling from New York out east across the United States, he had a sketchbook and a pencil. That's what he set out with. He tried to record with his sketchbook things that he saw. He ended up recording things that he heard passed down through stories. So some of his pieces of work that you see will not be from firsthand accounts that he saw as much as things that he heard sitting around the campfire from uh, in the form of stories and things like that. But some of the things he did see with his own eyes. So those would be what we consider more of primary resources. A lot of his paintings are secondary, maybe even more than secondary. So the person telling the story might have heard from someone who heard from someone. Maybe it's things they imagine based on part of what they see. So there's a lot of interpretation there, but some of his things, like I said, are primary resources because he saw with his own eyes and tried to record through sketches and painting exactly what he saw. So in this case, we see he's sketching some horses with some men riding on them. Over to the left is, I'm sure, as you figured out, him as a little boy. Here's a map of the West. The Old West. So we know some of the ways that people traveled where you can see this wagon, it's covered wagon. Um, you see some of the trails that are drawn on here. Those were common paths that people took. You know some of the reasons people chose certain paths, which were water sources. You see some of the major cities recorded on there, which are where they would stop because there are supplies, stores, other people that they could perhaps trade with or team up with and things like that, maybe get some advice from as they traveled. Remember, it was not easy to travel back and forth across our continent at that time because we didn't have all of the luxuries that we have now. Uh, so take a look at that for just a minute to see some of the paths. Oh, there's a photo of Remington in the bottom corner of this slide. This photo kind of makes me chuckle a little bit because he's wearing what we consider traditional Western clothing. Um, Someone who would be out riding a horse and maybe going and gathering their food um, out from the wilderness or building things and things like that. He did not commonly wear these clothes, which is why I think it's kind of cute that he has a photo in it. It shows he had a lot of regard for people who were living this lifestyle, maybe kind of a fascination, I don't know. But we'll see later what he typically wore. Even as he was traveling, we're told this wasn't normally what he was wearing. It was almost like he's dressing up like some of the people that he's met or has admired. Harper's Weekly. Harper's Weekly was a publication that one of the few and one of the very most popular publications of its time. So publication meaning like magazines and newspapers and things like that. Harper's Weekly, when one of the times that Remington returned to the East Coast with some of his sketches, they hired him on as and they called him the illustrator. Um, we for publications now we don't often have an illustrator, so someone trying to show through artwork what was going on at that time. That was one of their ways of showing what's going on. So he was hired on because they really appreciated the sketches that he had taken, some of the things he recorded that you couldn't see firsthand. They didn't have TV and things like that we have now. So they relied on people like Remington who were going back and forth coast to coast. And he ended up selling 170 pieces of his artwork to various publications at that time. So we see the Saturday Evening Post is another one that they're showing a picture of. That was another really popular publication of its time. Okay. Here's a quote we see: "I want to paint running horses so you can feel the details instead of just seeing them." So looking at this horse, what shows us that this horse is running? What shows us that this horse is working hard? Yeah, if you're thinking or maybe sharing with someone who might be watching this with you or looking at this PowerPoint with you, we see the action of the rider. So the way he's leaning, the way his arms are positioned. We can see the muscles in the horse, the way that the muscles are engaged. We can see the tail flying up in the air, the mane flying. We can see that they're on a hillside. We see the rocks there. A lot of detail that show us action. Frederic Remington in his studio, he collected and then hung and placed items from his travels in his studio. So look closely, you can see some of the things he collected along the way. One thing I appreciate about the things he collected things that represent all different groups of people. So he had a fascination with um, the Wild West, the cowboys, things like that. But you can see that he took things from some of the native groups as well. Um, he collected. I said took from them, which sounds like stole them or something. He collected them along his travels. And someone was recorded saying that at one point he when he became wealthy, after he had been an artist for a while and was selling work, he expanded his studio in such a way that he could have a horse and rider pose for him in his studio. Why do you think he wanted, other than the connection to it and kind of like souvenirs, what's another reason he might have kept these things posted and on display in his studio? If you look closely, you can see his easel is posted. He would work um, in his studio with all of these things around him so that to go along the vein of his wanting to have things realistic, if he's looking right at it, he can sketch a lot of the detail that he sees in those items. Hence having a horse and a rider come in his studio to observe. Okay, this is a sculpture into the fire. So um, like many of our artists, Frederic Remington started out doing one type of art um, and then built into his skill set another type of art, being sculpture. We can see it written right there at the bottom. Uh, Looking closely at his sculpture, we can see he put just as much detail into this type of art as he did into his paintings. He learned how to sculpt by watching, here's just a closer look at different different angles of the same piece of art. Um, a sculptor came to his hometown when he was back in New York and was working on a sculpture that was visible to everyone in town. And he just went and observed that person. He just thought, wow, this is really cool. Went and watched him, probably took some notes. I don't know. He definitely was sketching some of the things that he saw this person do. The person ended up giving Remington all of their tools when they left. And he continued doing the work himself. We're told that he took to it very quickly. It was an easy talent for him, a quick talent, I should say. And so, what do you think he's trying to portray in this sculpture here? We see action again of the horses. We see movement in their legs that looks like they're running. We see um, these men with their guns drawn in the air. And then I'm going to go back a slide. We're told if you look, those little things coming off of the top, that's supposed to be like gun smoke, and it was intentionally made really thin to look like it's going through the air. One thing we should mention about Remington and some of his work, remember I was saying some of his work is not firsthand observation. Um, Along with that, part of the reason some of it sold, part of the reason we use the word illustrator loosely when looking at news sources and things like that, in this sense, is because they weren't photographs, because they were sketches, some of the things, some of the draw to some of his work um, centered around a little bit of some exaggeration or some fantasy and things like that. So whether or not he saw this actually happening, we don't know. It could be a level of creativity he added to it. So we need to keep that in mind when we look at work that signifies a particular era, right? Okay. Here we have a buffalo hunter. So buffalo or bison, we see a picture down at the bottom. Some of you maybe you've seen these in person, depending on where you've been. Most of the time we see these in pictures, not in person. So these were animals that were known to be a great source of many things to people who lived off the land. So anyone who's out hunting their food, something like buffalo or bison would be a huge, let's see, it would be a huge quest. So something that would be very hard to hunt. And then also it brings great reward. So look at the amount of food that you could get off of bison. Look at the meat is lean and has a lot of protein. What other things do you think they used off of the bison? When we're talking about Native American groups or indigenous people, or any hunter that's out hunting animals like this, when we're told that they used every piece of the animal, what are they using besides the meat? Yeah, look closely. The bones, if you're thinking about the bones used for tools, um, used to help build things, whatever it is that they're needing to build. And then the hides used for clothing, used for shelter. Um, so maybe the bones and the hide combined would help build a shelter. That is a huge animal. And also, when I say it's a big quest to hunt something like this, bison can be very dangerous. It's a large mammal. It's a wild animal. So it would take a lot of skill, a lot of focus to be able to hunt an animal like this. Okay, here are a couple of photographs. So Remington, when he would travel back and forth, one thing he did do was take photographs. He would take photographs of different groups of people that he saw along the way. So we see a couple different examples here of clothing, a little bit of difference in the landscape. So we know that people wear different things, have different traditions, different. We see the piece of pottery, just a like cartoon picture there, and then shelter and a drum, an instrument. So looking at people's different traditions and different pieces of like patterns and colors and things like that based on where they lived. He was trying to get kind of a sampling of people from all different areas, so we can see that in those photographs. Here we see another painting that was based on an indigenous person, a Native American, but let's look at a little bit. We want to notice the difference between this versus the buffalo hunter. So what types of things do we see? This one has a calmer feel. The action is very clearly different. There's not a lot of action in this one. The colors are different, the terrain is different. Here's another piece of artwork. We're gonna look closely at this stagecoach being pulled by horses. What feeling do you think Remington's trying to give us in this painting? It's a little bit unsettling. It's like there's not a lot of action, but for some reason there's this kind of component of anxiety or something like that. And it's because it's at night. They're coming down a steep hill. He was trying to portray some of the feelings we might get thinking of all of our senses. So one thing that we're challenged to do when we look at this picture is think of what we might be smelling, what we might be hearing, what we might be seeing, what we might be feeling. Okay. All right, here's a side by side of our guy, Frederic Remington. So remember I said, for some reason I find it somewhat amusing. I appreciate his appreciation for the West and the traditional Western clothing. We should do quotes for that because there is no there's all different types of clothing as we can see. Some portrayed more than others. For example, on the right of this slide is what he actually wore most of the time, even during his travels, what we're told. And then on the left is a painting, a self-portrait of himself. So two pretty different looks there. Perception is everything, right? So he was known to wear. So he had red hair. He was a larger man. Than what he portrayed in his self-portraits, and then he wore what were called Old English riding boots, and his pants were called breeches, a fancy term for pants, and a red coat, quite different than the earth tones we see in his other clothing. We're going to close up here with just a few final thoughts on this. One thing, here's a nice picture of the desert. What I didn't mention earlier was his knowledge of horses actually started when he was younger. So his dad trained horses and raised horses as a hobby. And so from a young age, Frederic, even when growing up in New York, he was already going to farms and fairs and things like that and observing horses. So he did have a really big base layer of knowledge of horses that might have started his interest in how people were expanding out west. I'm not sure, but I forgot to mention that earlier about his dad. All right, I wish we were together so that I could ask if there's any questions or anything else you want to share. I love hearing your thoughts when we look at these pieces of work. Here's a couple more pictures, an actual photograph, of course. Here's some of the keywords that we want you to take away as we learn about Frederic Remington. We are going to figure out some way to present the actual art lesson. Some of you may already have the materials. We may be able to find a way to get materials to you. We're not sure yet what that's going to look like. We are hoping we'll get to do the lesson. It would be ideal if we get to do it together, but if not, we're going to try to figure out a way that you'll get to do it at your house. All right. Thanks for spending the time to go through this. Hope you all are well. Talk with you later.